The rain on Vesta Station wasn't water. It was condensed vapor reclaiming itself from the torn ventilation shafts, a cold mist that drifted like a memory through the docking alleys. It carried the taste of copper and ozone and a hint of old sea salt. Engineers said it was stress corrosion from the hull plating, but to wandering hearts and sleepless workers, it tasted like the breath of storms they'd never see again on worlds they'd left behind. Ethan Vale walked through that drifting rain like a stubborn shorebird, jacket zipped to the throat, palms nicked with old scars, a little limp hidden by stubborn pace. Behind him, 7 children moved in a tight cluster, tethered to his presence more than to any rope. They were a collection of nations and accents and foster histories, 2 born in orbital creches, one from a rusting tundra city, one from a farm dome that had become a mausoleum when the filters failed, 2 siblings who spoke only to each other, and 1 boy who had never known a planet at all. Ethan was their anchor because he chose to be, because someone had to be. They passed the flickering sign of Dock 13A, past the silent hull of a courier ship that would never fly again, and entered a narrow maintenance corridor whose walls sweated condensation. Somewhere beyond the station's arc, the war most people had stopped calling a war was still grinding across the shard-strewn routes between stars. Somewhere, the enemy fed on wreckage and fear and old maps of what had been. "Eyes on boots," Ethan said, soft. "No running, keep your packs tight." A chorus of quiet nods, little feet careful on metal grates. He had nearly reached the bulkhead gate when he saw her, kneeling beside a ruined cargo drone, skin like dusk blue glass with hair that burned copper-red beneath the flicker of emergency lamps. She was thin under a torn gray dress, breathing fast, fingers pressed to her abdomen in a gesture half protective, half ashamed. Her pupils flared when she saw the children, then shrank. A shimmer of bioluminescence stitched her collarbones like a string of stars. Ethan held up a hand, instinctively placing himself between the stranger and the kids. "It's all right," he said, voice steady, palms empty. "We're just passing through." The alien woman watched him with eyes that reflected the corridor like polished river stone. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and rough, like a hard-learned language wearing thin at the edges. "I can't have children," she said. "Don't be afraid." Ethan blinked. It was a strange assurance in a place full of stranger threats. "I can't," she repeated softer. "We can't, not since the burning, not since what they did. I won't take yours." The littlest of the kids, Mira, peered around him, a slip of hair stuck to her forehead by humidity. "She looks sad," Mira whispered. Ethan looked at the alien woman and saw more than sadness. He saw hunger layered with grief, the stubborn knot of a survivor who hadn't decided if surviving was worth the trouble. He recognized it because he wore it too on bad days. "Name?" he asked. She hesitated. "We used to sing them. Names. We don't sing much now. Call me Sarai. I'm Ethan." He tugged his wristband, activating the local scanner. No weapons flagged, no health alerts he could read, but the interface wasn't exactly designed for cross-species triage. "There's a clinic module 3 decks up," he said. "We're heading to a resettlement queue. We can walk together if you want." Sarai's gaze slid to the children again. "They're yours." "In the only way that matters," Ethan said. "I've got enough kids for both of us." Something like a smile threatened her mouth but died before arriving. She struggled to stand. He offered an arm, warm through the frayed jacket. Her skin was cool, the surface slick like sea stone. She weighed almost nothing and far too much at once. "Why help me?" she asked. "Because somebody helped me," he said. "Because I don't want to explain to them why I didn't." They moved as a unit through the station's nervous system, past shuttered storefronts and murals scabbed with soot. The children whispered among themselves in the coded language children always invent. A set of glances, a tug on a sleeve, a shared grin at a private joke about the squeak, a conduit clamp made every time they passed. Sarai kept a careful distance, yet her shoulders eased with every step that did not become pursuit. They reached a lift well and found it dead, the panel smeared with handprints. Ethan crouched and pried open the maintenance hatch with the slow confidence of a man who had wrangled more doors than arguments. The ladder inside rose into darkness. "Up we go," he said. Hands, feet, no looking down. Mira went first, then Tao and his quiet sister, then Jax and Lynn, then the creche pair, Tomas and Sierra, who were brave together and cautious alone. Ethan waited until Sarai placed her foot on the first rung, then followed. His jaw clenched against the old ache in his knee. He felt the ladder's vibration like a hummingbird heartbeat. He listened for the sound of trouble rising after them. He heard only their breath, the whisper of clothing, a distant drip. On deck 4, the hatch opened into a broad concourse ringed by shuttered kiosks. The lights were better here, but the people were worse. A cluster of men, hard-eyed, who had the lean, coiled look of those who'd traded their last good thing for a bad weapon. They watched the children and saw opportunity. They watched Sarai and saw a profit margin. They watched Ethan and saw an obstacle. Ethan saw their hands, no twitch toward a gun yet, but fingers weren't relaxed either. He felt Sarai freeze behind him. He put his voice on loudspeakers and softened the edges. "We're moving to clinic," he said, not a request, not a challenge. "Station Civic will pay for any escort you want to offer, or you can find a bar that still has light." The men traded a glance, the tallest one's lip curled. "That one's not Civic," he said, chin indicating Sarai. "You selling her or saving her?" "She's with me," Ethan said. "And who are you, father of the year?" "Father of 7, he said. "Lucky number 8 if you count me." It got a breath of laughter from Lynn, undercutting the tension. Humor was a thin blade, but it cut true when it had to. The men weighed the cost and benefit of pressing it. They saw the stance of someone who'd had to hit and had not missed often. They saw 7 pairs of eyes watching the watchers. They saw the security camera in the upper corner, cracked but blinking, and decided that hunger could wait for an easier meal. "Clinic's that way," the tall one muttered, and the group sloped away, turning their backs in the slow, careful manner of people who knew backs were the most honest part of the body, because they were the part you showed when you walked away from a fight. Sarai exhaled. Ethan nudged them forward, and they reached the clinic only to find its shutter dented inward like a fist print on a metal heart. A hand-painted sign on plasteel read, "Power transfer interrupted. Emergency operations only. Q begins at deck 2. The Q symbol flickered, then died. "Of course," Ethan murmured. He crouched to the children's height. "Plan B, food first, rest. Then we find the line that will take us off this tin can and onto something that floats and flies." "Will it be a planet?" Jax asked, a knife-sharp edge of hope folded under the question. "It'll be ground," Ethan said. "It'll be home until we need another. That's the trick." They cut through a maintenance arcade and followed the smell of broth. The food stall was a miracle of hunger alchemy. A woman with arms like steel piping ladling stew from a vat mounted over a jury-rigged heat coil. She had a plastic flower tucked into her hair and a scowl that said she'd punch a meteor if it interrupted lunch. "You feed those kids free," she said to Ethan before he could ask. "You pay me back when the world stops ending." He smiled with a gratitude that curled his spine. "Deal." "Not you," she added, pointing the ladle at Sarai. "What are you allergic to salt?" Sarai blinked. "I do not know." "Then you try a little," the cook said, softer. "We find out, sit, eat slow, keep the spoons." They did. The broth was thin but hot, and it landed in the gut like a promise. Sarai took a small sip and braced as if expecting lightning. When none came, she took another. Her blue skin blushed a fainter shade along the cheekbones, something like relief blossoming across her face. Ethan watched, and the small engine of his heart humored a hope he didn't recognize at first. He had learned to inventory risk the way medics inventory supplies. He had learned to measure joy by teaspoons, because that's how survival fed it to you. But he felt something like a vision then, uninvited. Sarai sitting at a table built from salvaged shipwood, Mira draping a ribbon down the center and declaring it a river. Jax pretending the salt shaker was a mountain. Everyone arguing about who got the last dumpling while a storm made music on a roof tree. It was the rarer kind of wanting, the brave kind. When the bowls were empty, they left a thank you and a promise they intended to keep, and moved toward the central concourse where the resettlement queue mustered. Along the way, Ethan noticed the first of the station's civic posters, plastered crooked, edges lifting in the damp. Civic Reinstatement Protocol, it read. Unauthorized non-human entities must declare sterility status upon entry. The text was printed in 3 languages and 2 scripts he didn't recognize. Someone had drawn a cartoon of a robot handing a bouquet to a cactus. He felt Sarai's glance. He felt her shrink. "They're afraid of us," she said. "They're afraid of babies," Ethan said, "because babies mean roots. Roots mean someone thinks they have a right to the ground they wake up on. Stupid trade, if you ask me. Why? Because roots also mean you stay to fix what's broken." At the queue, 100 souls stood in a room designed for 20. The line traced a miserable serpent through retractable belts, weaving past heat lamps and water tanks and a temporary console where a pair of tired officers processed ID. Families huddled in the coil's loops. Alone travelers guarded their bags like shrines. Above it all, the station's voice, too cheerful by half, announced delay metrics with apologies that had become a ritual prayer no one believed in. Ethan positioned the children and Sarai at the line's tail and counted heads again, the way he did every hour as if the act could prevent subtraction. He drew a breath that hurt a little. "Tomas, how's the knee?" "Fine," Tomas said, which meant it was haloing pain. He was 11 and brave because he thought no one would love him if he was not. Ethan ruffled his hair. "You tell me if it turns to glass. We'll trade it for a titanium one in the morning, maybe chrome." Tomas rolled his eyes, but the smile snuck out, raw and grateful. Sarai stood straight, trying to occupy less space than she needed. Her gaze tracked the officers as if trying to learn a language from the shape of mouths. Her hand still rested at her abdomen, a gesture that was less defense now and more memory. "What did they do to you?" Ethan asked softly, not because he wanted to know, but because he thought asking might be its own kind of tenderness. She kept her eyes on the line. "The machines that came to our world didn't speak, they cut. The sky turned to grids and the ground to maps. They took seeds, they took wombs. We kept singing because we thought sound could break their angles. It did not." "I'm sorry," he said. The words were thin, the feeling was dense as a collapsed star. "We learned to be other kinds of mothers," she said after a moment, the words spilling as if they'd been waiting somewhere behind her teeth. "We became aunties to the wind. We built schools for stones because stones remember forever. We learned to hold funerals for futures." He nodded. "I used to teach," he said, "before I learned how to scrape blood off a floor without crying." "What did you teach?" "Children, the small ones, how letters are houses for sounds, how numbers are bones for time, how every story is a door." A tiny smile flickered. "Do your children know that?" "They do," he said, voice softening. "Even when the doors lead us somewhere hard." The line moved as if the universe were dragging it by inches. Hours slipped their shoes off and padded barefoot into the gray. The children nodded, dozed standing, leaned against his hip, asked for water, asked the same questions they always asked about stars, and whether stars had neighborhoods, and whether they could mail a paper airplane to a nebula if they threw it hard enough. Sarai said little, but what she said mattered. She pointed out a long crack in the ceiling where mold had found a math the engineers hadn't planned, and Jax dubbed it the Great Green River, and they argued for 20 minutes about whether it flowed uphill. When they reached the console at last, the officer behind it barely glanced up. She had hair in a tight bun and a worry line between her brows that looked like it had been carved there with a blunt knife. "Names," she said, tapping the screen. "Status, destination." Ethan gave his name, then the children's, voice flattening into a bureaucrat's cadence. He had done this before, he would do it again. He hated that skill could grow in such soil. And the companion, the officer said, eyes flicking to Sarai with the weariness of someone whose compassion had been measured and rationed until it felt like contraband. Sarai, Ethan said, but the officer had keyed non-human F before he finished. Sterility status, the officer asked monotone. Verification. Sarai flinched as if struck. The words had the sound of a door slamming in rain. She's with me, Ethan said quietly. She's part of our household. Sterility status for non-human adults is mandatory. Sarai swallowed. I cannot bear, she whispered. None of us can, the officer waited. Verification. Ethan set both hands on the counter. You want a blood test, we'll take a blood test. We don't have cross-compatibility protocols for her species. Verification is a statement under penalty of travel ban should falsehood be discovered. Please nod if consenting. Sarai stood very straight and nodded once. The officer tapped. The screen chirped. Paper fed from a slot like a tongue. You are assigned to transfer shuttle A-17, she said. Boarding at Dock 22 in 2 hours. Destination, Temp Settlement Syllis Gamma. It's not much. Ethan smiled without humor. It's ground. The officer looked up and for a heartbeat her face softened. Keep them close, she said, gaze slipping to the children. There are recruiters in the dock alley. They promise work to kids. It's not work. I know, Ethan said. He knew too well. He had spent 3 nights hiding in a broken cryo locker with Lynn and Sierra while voices walked by saying their names like sweetmeats. We'll be ghosts. They moved into the waiting zone and sat on the floor like monks. Sarai's shoulders fell as if a weight had rolled off, then rolled back on from a different angle. Ethan watched the children unwrap their last paper cranes and set them on the floor in a little river, an armada of creases and hope. Jax looked up at Sarai. Is your world far? It is, she said. What was your favorite sound? Sarai thought about it and shook her head, surprised by her own answer. It was the sound of insects, a kind that made rain sounds in grass. We would lie down and put our ears to the ground and listen to the world thinking. Mira lay flat on the deck at once, pressing her ear to the cold. I hear the station thinking, she announced. It's saying I'm tired. Then we'll let it sleep, Ethan said. When the announcement finally came, transfer A-17 now boarding, it arrived like a door opening into warmth and light. They gathered their meager bags, their cranes, their patience, and filed toward Dock 22. The dock alley was as the officer warned. Men and women with eyes like ledgers, hands that weighed children like coin. Ethan walked through their teeth like a quiet storm, and none of them tried him. Sarai followed with her face a lake in which nothing reflected because the lake had learned not to tell secrets. The shuttle was a stitched thing, a retired transport with new seats and old bolts, its hull patched with a laughing variety of metals. Ethan loved it at once. It reminded him of his heart. They strapped in among other families and loners, the air thick with the tense gratitude of those who knew their escape might still be a rumor. As the shuttle lifted, the station shrank in the port view like a coin dropped in the sea. Beyond, Vesta's jagged belt glinted like broken glass. The children pressed their faces to the window. Sarai did not look outside, she looked at them. The burn of acceleration pressed them back, then the world softened. The seatbelt dug a polite line into Ethan's sternum. He swallowed, felt the sweet fizziness of hope. He looked at Sarai and saw her eyes closed, as if she were afraid to open them and discover the shuttle had been a trick. He reached across the aisle and let his hand rest. Just a breath, near hers, not touching, an offer without price. She opened her eyes and looked at that hand as if it were a small, stubborn city that had lit its lamps at dusk. And after an eternity she let her hand drift until the backs of their fingers met, cool to warm, old to new, grief to grief. The shuttle coasted easy as a sigh. The children slept, even Jax's jaw unclenched, a small piece of armor sliding off with a click. Ethan's body wanted sleep too, but his mind had no brakes. He watched the port view as the shuttle curved toward a blue-gray moon orbited by rings like a saint's wonky halo. Syllis Gamma was a reclamation colony. Not much, the officer had said. He had never needed much, except a door to lock and a window to open and a table with enough chairs. Gravity reasserted itself soft. The shuttle nudged down through bruise-colored clouds and kissed a landing pad that had seen too many kisses. The ramp unfolded like a hesitant tongue, and the smell that came up to meet them was different. Damp dirt, lubricants, the sharp mint of new forest growth from hydrodomes. The sound was new too, distant machinery, distant laughter. They filed out. The terminal was a series of tents joined by corridors, everything temporary and determined. Holosigns projected cues. Volunteers in orange vests shepherded. The horizon lifted its shoulders into a low wall of mountains wearing fog like shawls. The sky was the color of an hour before rain. A woman broke from the volunteer line and approached, tablet in hand. "Welcome to Syllis Gamma Temporary Settlement," she said, voice clipped but kind. "I'm Lena. You're A17. Yes, single adult household with dependents and guest." Her eyes touched Sarai and did not harden. "Guest," Ethan said. "Family," he added, testing how the word tasted. It tasted like a promise baked in a low flame. Lena nodded. "Good, we have a modular, it's a shell, cots, a heater, a locking door, there's a school dome, there's a clinic, there's work if you want it. It's not safe, but it's safer than where you came from." "Good," Ethan said, meaning it in all directions. They walked the compacted dirt path toward a row of prefab units that crouched like polite beetles near a drainage ditch. Children ran between them in a tangle of laughter and the inexplicable certainty that games are the best way to declare ownership of space. A boy with a shaved head zipped past, yelling, "We're building a fortress. It needs a dragon." Another child shouted back, "We have a dragon if she brings her own roar." Sarai's mouth quirked in something like amusement, something like hurt. The door to their assigned unit hissed open. Inside was a single room with a partition that pretended to privacy, a hot plate, a wash basin, a tiny window cut like a letter in the wall. There was dust on the sill like forgotten sugar. Lynn and Sierra ran immediately to the window and named it. "This is ours," Lynn said, breath fogging the glass. "This is the picture frame for tomorrow." Ethan put down the bags and sat hard on a cot that had the soft give of tired foam. The room was small, but it was theirs. He had a key. He turned it in the lock with a ceremony that made the children's eyes shine. He turned it back again because freedom meant choosing whether doors were open or closed. "We'll need blankets," he said. "We'll need the children registered at the school dome. We'll need food tokens, water allotment. We'll need to breathe," Sarai said, voice almost playful. "We can list the world tomorrow." He nodded and let his shoulders fall and felt absurdly like crying. Not because things were hard, which they were, not because they were safe, which they were not, but because he had said tomorrow and believed it. That night, under a roof that belonged to them for as long as they defended it with patience and paperwork and stubborn joy, they slept. Ethan woke twice with the war's old alarms in his blood. He woke a third time to a small hand sliding into his, not afraid, just confirming that the world had not left their bodies behind. He squeezed and heard a breath ease and drifted down again into that warm deep where memory and dream shake hands. In the morning, Rain explored the roof with careful fingers. He brewed a packet of something that pretended to be coffee. Sarai stood at the window with her hand on the sill, watching a line of ants mapping a geography only ants understood. "You don't have to stay," Ethan said, "because you must give people doors." She did not turn. "Where would I go that isn't a place I carry with me?" she asked. "I have nowhere to be but the next thing. It might as well be here." He nodded, a smile clipping onto his mouth like a light. "All right," he said. "Help me find the school dome. The kids need something to complain about." They found it at the settlement center, A bulb of plasteel and optimism, benches out front, children's artwork flapping on nylon lines. A man with a knot of hair and a shirt that said I survived 3 budgets and all I got was this program stood by the entrance with a register. We're short teachers, he said without preamble. You look like you can keep a room from eating itself. I can, Ethan said. I used to. Good, you're hired. We pay in food credits and the kind of gratitude that turns to dust after a week. Ethan laughed. That's my favorite kind. Sarai stood very straight, watching the swarm of children swirl around her legs as if she were a rock in a playful stream. One little girl stopped and stared at Sarai's skin like night. Are you cold? The girl asked. Sometimes, Sarai said. The girl took her hand with the matter-of-fact courage only children and saints possess. Then I'll be the sun, she announced, and dragged Sarai into a game where people ran in circles and pretended the floor was lava. Sarai stumbled at first, then found the rhythm, then laughed, startled by the sound coming out of her as if she'd pulled it up by accident from a well that had looked empty and found it full. Ethan watched and felt his day widen. Work came quickly. The settlement had a metabolism. It needed hands. Ethan taught small ones to put letters in a row and build bridges with numbers, and write their names without apologizing for them. In the afternoon, he helped reinforce the drainage ditch with sacks of gravel that had once been part of a courthouse on a planet none of them would see. At night, he read a chapter aloud from a broken-spined book he'd carried through 3 systems, and the children drifted into sleep with their mouths open like waiting birds. Sarai found work in the hydrodome where her cool hands and long fingers were a match for delicate roots. She spoke kindly to the cucumber vines like old friends, and they twined toward her voice. She learned the timers and the nutrient lines and the strange electric songs that heaters sang when they were tired. She learned names again. It hurt less than she thought it would. It hurt differently. She spent her lunch break sitting with Ethan at the edge of the dome where condensation made rain on the inside, and they let their knees touch, not by accident. He did not ask again about children. She did not offer. They talked instead about bread, about the way dough behaved like a small galaxy under your hands, about the best way to steal an hour for yourself. About comics, the children drew of a superhero named the Fixer who could repair any broken thing with a look if you believed hard enough. For a time, they made a life out of small daring acts. Sleeping with both shoes off, leaving a cup on a table and trusting it would be there when they returned, laughing loudly enough that someone in the next module knocked the wall and laughed back. Then, as bad stories teach and good stories remember, trouble found them. It arrived first as a rumor. A caravan had been hit by a splinter group who claimed the settlement was a kind of trespass against the memory of a planet none of them had ever loved. Then it arrived as a shadow on a hill and a dust plume on the road. Then it arrived as men with black rags tied around their sleeves, moving with the professional certainty of those who have practiced being terrible. They came at dawn, when the rain paused to catch its breath. Ethan was at the school dome early, prepping a lesson on fractions using broken cookies. He heard the first crack of a shot and felt his stomach turn into a stone. He stepped outside and saw the men at the fence line, saw the volunteers at the gate, saw the children waking and making the kind of sound children make when they do not understand what loud noises want from their bones. He did not run toward the fight. He ran toward the modulars. Inside, Lynn and Sierra sat on the floor with Mira, braiding a rope from old cloth strips. The rope trailed like a tail. Their eyes flew to him. Under the cot, he said, quiet as secrets, stay until you hear my voice. They slid under it with the practiced speed of soldiers, eyes bright, mouths thin. Sarai burst through the door a moment later, hair wet with hydrodome mist. The gate, she said, breathless. They're cutting through. Ethan nodded. We hide the kids, he said. Then we buy time. Time for what? For the rest of us to become who we say we are, he said. Open the crawl panel. She knelt and pulled back the thin wall where wiring ran and a dark triangular space yawned. The children slid into it like fish, not afraid because this was a game they had been taught, and every time they had played it before, when the world ended, it had started again. He replaced the panel and dragged the cot in front and smiled at Mira through the crack. "What if you don't come back?" she whispered. "I will," he said, "because your shoelaces are always a mess." Her giggle broke the moment like sunlight. They stepped outside. The settlement sounded like wreckage making up its mind, whine of cutting tools, shouts, the metallic bark of makeshift weapons. The attackers had a shape, a wedge driving for the school dome, because if you take the school, you take the future. Ethan moved to intercept. Sarai matched his stride without speaking. Fear quaked in her limbs like a tuning fork struck hard, but under it was a geology that did not tremble. At the edge of the schoolyard, he found Lena and 3 volunteers behind a stack of sandbags that had definitely not been designed for a firefight. She had a small rifle held like a baton. He took his place beside her. "Nice day," he said. "Lovely," she said. "Take left, I'm almost out." He dove, rolled, felt the warm comfort of ground. The barrel of a weapon glinted. He threw a rock with the accuracy of a man who had spent a lot of afternoons convincing bored students to duck a playful toss. The rock hit the glint. The shot went wide. He popped up and yelled, "Hey!" The kind of hey that makes people turn their heads because it's your teacher voice and it belongs to everyone who ever held your hand while you learned. 3 heads turned. Lena took 2 of them with shots that were more warning than kill, knees, shoulders. Ethan saw Sarai out of the corner of his eye, moving toward the flank, face a pale fire. She didn't carry a weapon. She carried a coil of tubing from the hydro dome and a jar of nutrient gel. He almost yelled at her to get down. She moved like a flood. An attacker lunged for the school door, blade in hand. Sarai snapped the tubing around his wrist, the gel on it making it slick but sticky, and yanked, using his momentum against him. He fell hard. She stepped onto his arm and looked into his face and said, voice low and terrible, "No," as if the word were a law. He did not rise. For an electric instant, the attackers faltered. They saw a blue-skinned woman whose people had lost their future make herself into a wall for someone else's. They saw a man with no gun throw truth like stones. They saw a line of volunteers who had been accountants and cooks yesterday suddenly become dangerous because danger was necessary. The calculus shifted. Then the wedge reformed. A man in the center raised a flare and shouted. A second group peeled away, sprinting, and Ethan realized with a cold slither in his back that this was a distraction. The real push was veering toward the hydro dome. If you take the water, you take the breath. "Sarai," he said, pointing. She was already running. He followed. Lena called after him, then cursed and followed too. They reached the dome's entrance as the attackers reached the nutrient tanks. The tanks hunched like silver animals, warm and faithful and full of the settlement's heartbeat. A figure raised a charge. Sarai didn't slow. She hit him with her shoulder like a comet, and they both went down in a tangle. Ethan arrived a step later, caught the falling charge, and hurled it through the open cargo hatch into the mud where it sizzled like an angry egg and died. "Nice throw," Lena gasped. "Old coach," he said, breath ragged. The fight turned then, not because more of them were brave, but because brave can be contagious. Settlers emerged like bees from modules. A carpenter with a wrench the size of Faith. A kid with a slingshot and deadly aim. A grandmother who yelled at an attacker so fiercely he dropped his knife because he remembered when his own grandmother had scolded him for something, and the wound of that rebuke had never healed. The attackers found themselves not facing soldiers but facing people who refused to be subtracted. They broke. They ran. 2 were caught and tied with cords stripped from field tents. One lay on the ground with his hands over his head, muttering a prayer that might have been for forgiveness and might have been for a second chance to be cruel. The others fled toward the road, where their dust and their fear became the same cloud. Ethan stood very still. He listened. He heard the school dome not on fire. He heard children crying and then not crying because someone told a joke about fractions dividing up the danger and failing to get an even number. He heard the hydro dome systems exhale like lungs. He felt the wild blessing of a heartbeat that didn't hurt anymore. Sarai stood beside him, hair plastered to her neck, eyes wide and a face pale with adrenaline. She was shaking. He reached out and steadied her with a hand at the elbow. She looked at him as if surprised she'd done it, as if bravery had taken her shape like a borrowed coat and fit better than she imagined. "You were beautiful," he said before his brain could edit the kindness into something safer. She blinked and made a small sound that could have been a laugh or could have been a sob. "I told you," she said, breathless. "I cannot be a mother, but I can be a wall." He smiled. Family needs both. Later, when statements were taken and wounds were bound and the dead, 2 attackers and 1 volunteer who had put himself between a boy and a bullet, were laid on pallets, the settlement gathered in the open space beside the school dome. Lena stood on a crate because people needed a place to look. The rain had returned, soft as a lullaby. "We held," she said. "They'll come again, we'll hold again. We'll hold until holding isn't the work anymore." From the back, a voice said, "What about the kids?" It wasn't fear. It was logistics disguised as fear. Ethan felt the eyes on him. He wasn't sure when he had become a figure or a rumor. He stepped forward because someone had to. "We teach them to read," he said. "We teach them to plant. We teach them to be kind in stronger ways than anyone has been cruel to them. That's how we win what we're trying to win." Sarai, still at his side, added in her quiet wave-on-rock voice, "We teach them to sing to stones." People laughed, then fell thoughtful, not because they understood what she meant, but because they wanted to. Night wrapped the settlement like a blanket that had lost some of its fibers, but still warmed because it had been warmed before by other bodies. Ethan sat on the step of their module with Sarai and watched the ditch carry away the rain. The children were inside, asleep in a tangle of limbs and dreams. He could hear the soft huffing of breaths and the periodic words that leak out of dreams like code. His shoulder brushed hers. The warmth where their bodies met was a small furnace, a lit coal in a cold room. "You meant it," she said finally, not looking at him. "When I said I can't have children, you said you had enough for both. You meant it." "I did," he said. "I do. I don't know how to be what you are for them." "You don't have to be what I am," he said. "You just have to be what you are." "What am I?" He thought about the blue of her skin. He thought about the strength of her no. He thought about the silence where a song had been and the courage it took to sing something else. "You're Sarai," he said. "You're the sound of insects in grass. Your hands that know when to be gentle and when to be hard. You're here." She nodded, a small motion that looked like acceptance and like a new piece of architecture added to a house that had needed it for a long time. "I can be here," she said. He nodded toward the window. "They'll make you drawings. They'll ask you to braid their hair. They'll show you rocks that are secretly spaceships. You'll tell them stories of your world. And one day when someone asks them where they are from, they'll say, a place with blue sky and a lady whose hair looked like fire taught us to listen to the ground. That's a kind of inheritance." Sarai closed her eyes. She let the rain's music fill the spaces in her bones that had been set aside for grief. "We used to say," she murmured, "that a village belongs to those who plant trees whose shade they will never sit in. I think I could be a tree here. We could plant an orchard," he said, grinning. She laughed, full now. "An orchard," she repeated, tasting the word. They did. Or they began the slow, stubborn process that is the same thing as doing. Weeks slid by full of dirt under fingernails and new routines and jokes that became traditions. Sarai learned to turn a bolt with her teeth when her hands were busy. Ethan learned to stand up slower so his knee didn't punish him for speed. The children learned to cook rice without burning it to the bottom of the pot. The rice still burned sometimes because that's how rice teaches. Ethan became a formal teacher again. Half days in the dome where the sun painted the floor with leaf shadows and the smell of wet plastic mixed weirdly with the smell of new books. He built a lesson about constellations that were not myths yet, inviting the children to name them: the winking fox, the long spoon, the upside-down house. Sarai sat in when she could, eyes shining. When he looked up and saw her there, he found his voice steadier. There were nights when the settlement held potlucks, and the tables wobbled with foods that had never touched before. Noodles beside salted fish, beside spiced mush, beside something Sarai made from hydro herbs that tasted like green and salt, and a little like the first day of school smells. There were mornings when the siren test caught them still in sleep, and they scrambled to the shelter laughing, because if you can't laugh at drills, they'll eat you. There were afternoons when the horizon darkened with storm true rather than storm rumor, and they set buckets and pots out to catch the sky's generosity and danced in it when no one was watching. There were also letters. Someone set up a relay at the comms tent and messages found their way across the nets. Ethan received one from an old colleague in a city he had only visited twice. The letter said, "We lost the north wing of the school. We saved the library. Come if you can." Sarai received one from nowhere and everywhere. A voice file in a language she had not heard in too long. It was a cousin or a friend or a stranger who used to share a name. It said, "We are alive on a world that tolerates our songs. It is far. It is cold. It is ours." She wept quietly and then laughed and wept again and then pressed the tiny speaker to her chest and said, "All right, I will keep being alive too." One sunset he found her on the edge of the settlement, where the packed dirt gave way to a sweep of grass that had learned to live with wind. She stood with her arms crossed, staring toward a line of dark trees. "What do you see?" he asked. "Old things," she said, "new things wearing old clothes." He stood beside her. "I see a picnic we haven't had yet." She smiled sideways. "The children will demand watermelon." "We'll demand quiet for 5 minutes," he said. "We will not get it." She took a breath and let it out slow. "Sometimes I think the machines stole more than my future. They stole my permission to want." "You have it back," he said. "Do I?" He reached for her hand and took it, warm now from many days under human suns. "You do," he said. "By law of this place and by law of me." She squeezed his hand and did not let go. The next trouble came not with guns but with a whisper that turned into policy. A transport ship landed and disgorged officials in neat uniforms who looked at the settlement and saw a spreadsheet that needed compressing. They saw Sarai and saw complication. They saw the children and saw problems that might become statistics if mishandled. Lena hosted them in the school dome. The officials unfolded maps with edges so crisp they could cut. "Temporary settlement duration exceeded," one said, tapping a little square that represented 100 people who had names and laugh styles. "We transitioned to phase 2, consolidation." "Consolidation," Lena repeated, tasting it like sour fruit. "Meaning move people far from the orchards they planted. Meaning efficiency," another said. "Meaning fewer targets." Ethan kept his voice gentle as a well-laid trap. "And what about roots?" he asked. The official's eyebrow climbed toward orbit. "This is not an agricultural colony," she said. "It is now," he said. Sarai stepped forward, hands loose at her sides. "I work the hydro dome," she said. "I am part of the food. If you move us, you starve the ground that learned us." "That's not how nutrient cycles work," the third official muttered. "That's exactly how they work," Sarai said, and the room murmured because truth, when said in a voice that comes from a place without lies, makes people sway. The officials retreated to confer. Lena leaned toward Ethan and Sarai and whispered, "I can't stop them with rules. We need something they want." "What do they want?" Ethan asked. "Credit for a success." Ethan thought about it, then grinned like a fox asked to present a syllabus. "Let's show them a school that is so successful they can't afford to break it." In the next 2 weeks, the dome became a theater, not the kind with lights and curtains, the kind with benches and charts and the fierce, undeniable proof that children who should have been broken were learning. They staged a lesson on water cycles with a rainstorm that Lena summoned by opening the mist valves on a timer. They mapped the settlement's drainage ditch into a river system, complete with paper boats named after cities that didn't exist anymore, because if you name a thing, you hold it longer. They presented a cross-species lullaby taught by Sarai, who sang to stones and to children and to the officials' quiet surprise with the same respect. They read aloud from the letters they had sent and received. They built a machine out of junk that turned footstomps into electricity for a string of tiny lights, and when the children stomped in rhythm, the bulbs flared like laughing stars. The officials watched. Their pens slowed. One of them cried quietly and didn't hide it well enough. In the end, they said, Phase 2 will be adjusted to accommodate successful pilot programs in community stabilization. It was bureaucrat for fine, stay. That night, the settlement celebrated with a feast made from whatever had not been counted yet. Sarai danced, and the small lights caught in her hair. Ethan realized, with the simple astonishment that accompanies discoveries you thought you were too old for, that happiness was not a rumor, and neither was everything that comes after happiness if you are brave enough to let it. Midway through a song, Sarai wobbled. She sat quickly, face gone distant. He crouched beside her. "Too much?" he asked. "Just a wave," she said, hand at her stomach. It was an old gesture that did not mean what it once meant. He had learned enough of her to know it was how she placed herself in her own body when her body felt like borrowed ground. "Breathe," he said. "I'm here." She did. He was. The children found them and piled into their laps like clumsy cats. "Dance," Mira demanded. "We are dancing," Ethan said. "In our bones." The music moved through the night like a weather pattern. The stars tried on the settlement and decided it fit. When the news finally came that the war that wasn't was fracturing, that the machines were faltering, that a coalition of small, stubborn worlds had made one big, stubborn punch that the enemy couldn't absorb, it came via a courier ship painted with 100 handprints. The pilot stepped out and said, "You did not hear it from me, but you heard it from me," and the square erupted. People hugged like it was a job. The children shouted things that could not be physically possible and promised to make them possible. Lena put her head on a post and cried. Ethan stood very still and let relief move through him like a weather system. Sarai leaned into him and let herself believe in tomorrows not offered like bribes but given like birthdays. They did not declare victory. They declared respite. It was enough. One morning, months or years, time had the decency to blur when you fed people. After the first rain on the roof, a small shuttle coasted down and set its belly on the pad. From it stepped 2 people with skins the color of twilight and hair like old copper. They wore coats that had been patched with love and eyes like lakes. When Sarai saw them, she made a sound that tore the air sweetly and ran. They were from the message. Her cousin Kin and the cousin's partner. They held her like a bridge holds the wind. They spoke the old language against her skin like rain, like prayer. They wept and laughed and took turns standing back to count her fingers as if the number might have changed. They were family. They had found a world that tolerated their songs. It was far and cold and fiercely theirs, as the message had said. They had come for her, or to bring a piece of that there to this here, or to confirm the simple miracle that 2 places could be lived in by the same heart. They ate at Ethan's table. They told stories of blue-white grasses that hummed at night and caves that echoed 3 times, no more, as if they counted your words before keeping them. The children listened with the greedy politeness of treasure thieves. After, when the sun fell heavy and the ditch whispered, Sarai stood with Ethan beneath the old tarp he'd strung to cover the step. "They want me to see it," she said. "Their world, the cold one, they want me to come for a season, maybe 2. He looked at her with a gaze that was a wall and a door at once. "Do you want to?" "I want to and I don't want to," she said. I want to stay, I want to go. I want to carry both worlds without splitting at the seams. Then we sew stronger seams, he said. She laughed. You make it sound easy. It won't be, he said, but we don't do easy, we do true. True, she echoed, tasting it. The children found out because children always do and staged a meeting on the floor complete with a paper speaking stick. Mira stood on a crate and declared, we vote Sarai should go and then come back and bring us pictures and rocks and songs and recipes. Seconded, Jack said, solemn as a mayor. Thirded, Tomas said roughly, but she has to come back. She will, Ethan said, not as a hope but as a contract he would enforce against the universe. Sarai went. She went in a shuttle with blue hands waving at the window and children running alongside until someone yelled at them to stop. She went with a kiss pressed to Ethan's palm because some goodbyes must be held before they can be released. She went with a promise she had learned from him. Family is not a set of names, it's a direction. She came back in the thaw, which meant the season meant something to somebody somewhere. She brought a satchel of stones that sang when you rubbed them together, and she brought photographs of a sky that wore its stars like armor, and she brought recipes for soups that tasted like wind. She brought herself, which was the important import. She brought a new way of standing, a new gentleness in the wrists, a new strength in the words, I am home. Time passed in the way that makes a life, by refusing to be noticed until it asked to be honored. The children grew. Lynn and Sierra cut their hair and then grew it out again because identity is a conversation with the mirror. Jax discovered he loved engines because engines were puzzles that made noise. Mira learned to climb and then taught the next cluster of littles how to climb with the grace of a cat and the caution of a grandmother. Tomas's knee decided to behave, mostly, especially when you talked to it like you were disappointed but still loved it. Ethan's limp worsened in the cold. Sarai wrapped his knee in a brace she had woven from hydro lines and kindness. They shared a bed in the way that people who do not remember when they started sharing a bed share. Unconsciously, like breathing, it had nothing to do with paper. It had everything to do with survival, which they had made into something that looked from some angles like joy and from other angles like art. One late evening, a courier came breathless with a data pad. You have a message, she said to Ethan, to Sarai, to the settlement. From the coalition, from Earth. They gathered in the dome. The message flickered to life, the voice of a person who spoke carefully, aware that each word would plant a flag in someone's heart. We invite representatives from Syllis Gamma Temp Settlement to attend the treaty accord on Vale. This accord will recognize settlement communities as essential organs of the galactic body. We ask for your presence because you held when others failed, because you taught, because you made a school into a fortress and a hydro dome into a cathedral, because you sang to stones. Lena snorted. That's you, she said to Sarai. No, Sarai said, laughter shining. That's us. They argued bloodlessly about who should go and settled it the way good communities do, by volunteering those who had already volunteered for other impossible tasks. Ethan and Sarai and Lena went. Jax begged to go and was only denied because someone needed to keep the engines honest at home. He accepted the logic with the heartbroken dignity of the nearly grown. The Accord world was a slice of light amid a lot of mediated darkness. The hall smelled like ozone and expensive nerves. Delegates wore suits that said, "We have learned to wear armor that looks like fabric." They greeted Ethan and Sarai and Lena with a mixture of curiosity and rehearsed warmth. Sarai felt like a beetle under glass and also like a comet invited to a garden party. She held Ethan's hand under the table because the comfort of his knuckles had become a ritual. When it was their turn to speak, and it was, because the coalition had learned something about optics or because it had learned something about the math of survival, Ethan stepped to the dais and let his voice find the register that made rooms lean forward. He told a simple story, about a station that rained not water, about an alien woman who could not have children because cruelty had drawn a map through her future, about 7 kids who called him home and let him call them his, about a settlement that should not have lasted the first winter and lasted anyway by growing people the way you grow gardens, patiently, forgivingly, against forecasts. He did not say we deserve this. He said we are this. He said choose us because we already chose each other. Then Sarai stood. She said fewer words than he had and made them weigh more. You try to write the future as a line, she said to the hall and to the world. We live the future as a circle. Let us keep our circle. Stand in it with us. It has room. There was applause. There were whispers. There was the quiet shift of history deciding to look a different direction for a while. They returned to Syllis with documents that would make some trouble easier and some harder. They returned with new requests for help and new shipments of book spines and spools of wire. They returned with a promise that was not a guarantee but was not a lie. Children ran to meet them. Mira attached herself to Sarai's waist with the ferocity of a vine. Jax asked if the engines on Vale had better torque. Tolmas pretended to be unimpressed and then cried into Ethan's jacket like it was raining inside the jacket, and the jacket could deal with it. That evening, under a sky that had forgiven them another messy day, they lit small lanterns and set them along the ditch, where the water took each tiny moon and distributed it down the long line of the settlement like a rumor of stars. Sarai pressed her temple to Ethan's shoulder. You look tired, she said. I'm always tired, he said, smiling. I plan to be tired until I die. Not today, she said softly, and kissed the corner of his mouth with the authority of someone who had declared a holiday. The next morning, the orchard they'd planted in defiance and hope finally showed fruit. Small, shy things, green as beginnings. The children gathered around as if waiting for a birth. Sarai touched a leaf with reverence. They are late, she said, and right on time. Mira whispered, I hear the world thinking. What's it thinking? Ethan asked. It's thinking we did good. He swallowed, suddenly unable to speak. Sarai's fingers found his. Time, old friend, old thief, kept moving. The settlement built better fences, then built better neighbors. The war ended in the way wars end. With signatures, with silence, with a lot of work for people who would never get their names on a plaque. The machines became wreckage and then became raw material, and then became parts of kitchens and bicycles, and the little wind harps children hung from tree branches, so that the wind would remember to sing. On a day that had been ordinary until it decided otherwise, a woman came to the settlement with a child in her arms and a story in her eyes. She was human, her face a map of miles. The child was blue as evening and wrapped in a blanket that said someone had loved someone even if no one could continue loving them the way the story wanted. We found him in a cargo crate, the woman said, voice shaking like a compass near a magnet. We asked around. Someone said you. Sarai held out her arms and the child fit as if there had been a place there shaped exactly like him. He blinked up at her, eyes like new stone polished by river. Ethan stood beside her and felt the air change, the way it does when a door opens in a house you thought had all its doors already accounted for. The woman stammered apologies as if she had broken something by delivering this gift. Lena hugged her until the apologies dissolved. The children circled like planets learning a new orbit. The settlement breathed in and out, adjusting, as it had adjusted when anyone arrived or left or changed. Sarai looked at Ethan over the small head in her arms. There were tears in her eyes and something else, something that looked like terror and ecstasy building a bridge together. He nodded and the nod said everything. It said yes. It said family. It said we will ruin this child with love. They named him River because the ditch had supported them longer than most governments. They gave him 2 more names, one from Sarai's old world that meant now, and one from Ethan's grandmother that meant again. because those were the directions they intended to move in. Raising one more made everything the same and everything new. Sarai learned the weight of a sleeping child on her chest, which is the weight of the world when you finally want it. Ethan rediscovered the exhaustion peculiar to love that cannot schedule itself. The children learned what it meant to be suddenly older. It felt like a crown and like a heavy hat. The settlement learned that lullabies could be written on the fly in 4 languages and still hush a baby if the person singing believed. River grew into the place they'd made him. He grew in the way children do when they are wanted and the world cooperates occasionally. Too fast, just fast enough. He had her eyes and his laugh and the stubborn jawline of someone destined to argue with authority for righteous reasons. He stapled together pictures of forts and planets and demanded treaties before bedtime. He asked the kind of questions that had to be answered with, "I don't know, kid, but we'll find out together." Years or months, who counts when the counting makes you dizzy with gratitude later, a group of travelers stopped by the settlement. They wore the look of people who had learned to be careful without forgetting how to marvel. One of them, human and tired, stood by the orchard and watched as Sarai and Ethan taught River to prune a young tree. He took notes as if pruning were a new weapon. He asked, when the time was polite, "Where did you learn this?" "From those who learned it from those who learned it from trying not to die," Ethan said. The traveler nodded like he had heard a poem. "I'm gathering stories," he said. "Stories of how people stayed human when the world tried to convince them to be less." Sarai tilted her head. "And what will you do with them?" "Tell them," he said simply. "Good," she said. "Tell them that I could not have children, and then tell them," the traveler finished for her, smiling, "that a human smiled and said, 'I've got enough kids for both.'" Sarai felt tears prick and did not blink them away. She did not need to be brave in that direction anymore. "Tell them it was true," she said. The traveler nodded and wrote this down with a pen that scratched like a cricket in summer grass. He asked to see the school. They showed him. He sat in the back and cried behind his hand when Tomas, now taller than his fear, read aloud a speech about circles and lines that would have broken a lesser planet. He ate soup in the hydrodome and said it tasted like wind. He left carrying a jar of river stones that sang when you rubbed them together. Sarai and Ethan watched him go and then went back to the work that makes it possible to watch people go without breaking. Teaching, cooking, scolding, laughing, maintenance of systems and souls. There were setbacks because there always are. A late frost stole half the orchard's second harvest. A sickness ran through the modules and stole 2 elders while the clinic's heater stuttered like a choked-up choir. A storm pushed the ditch out of its banks and rearranged the ground with the confidence of an artist unimpressed by prior work. They stood and hammered and held and rebuilt, as they had and as they would. Between all that, there were mornings so beautiful they felt like the apology of a universe that knew it had been unkind. There were afternoons when River fell asleep in the shade of the upside-down house constellation, drawn in chalk on the schoolyard. There were nights when Sarai and Ethan sat in the doorframe of their home and touched shoulders, and watched lightning roll its bones beyond the mountains, and spoke aloud the names of people who had gotten them to this exact minute. Because gratitude is a practice. Because remembrance is a seed you plant in somebody else's day. News from the wide galaxy came on odd winds. The machines were not gone but had learned to fear certain songs. Earth was rebuilding her coasts with stubborn hands. A coalition of settled worlds had decided to prioritize engines that ran on hope and practicality rather than despair and genius. It was both better and worse than anyone predicted, which is to say it was real. When River turned 7, they staged a game in the schoolyard that was not a game. The children formed a circle. The adults formed a circle around them. In the center, Sarai placed a small box. Inside was a pick, a gardener's small tool, sharp with purpose. "This is yours," she said to River, her voice thick and delicious with pride. "You are old enough to help make what we live on." River took the tool as if it were a sword and a spoon and a star. He looked at Ethan, seeking the approval he knew he had and still needed to see like a stamp. Ethan said, "Use it to make holes for seeds. Use it to open old boxes. Use it to steer your heart when it forgets the way home." River nodded solemnly and then ran off to poke at dirt with the glee of someone whose first job had just been assigned, and whose first job carried the weight of God's. That night, the settlement threw a party smaller than the treaty and bigger than a Tuesday. They danced under strings of lights powered by stomps. They ate bread that cracked like laughter. They watched River fall asleep under a table with the pick on his chest like a knight with his sword. And they did not move him because some moments are perfect because they include inconvenience. Sarai and Ethan lay awake later. The soft night sounds a choir. "Do you ever think," she whispered, "about what would have happened if you had walked past me in the station?" "Every day," he said, "and every day I decide not to invent that world." "We built this," she said, wonder in the words. "We did," he said, "with stolen parts and legal paperwork and kisses." She laughed into his shoulder. "Be serious." "I am," he said. "Kisses held this place together as much as sandbags." She considered that and decided it was an engineer's truth. She kissed him slow, the roof ticked as it cooled, the year slipped another notch. On a morning in a spring that had decided to finally indulge them, a delegation from another settlement arrived, curious. They had heard rumors. They had heard words like orchard and school and stone songs. They had heard Sarai's name and Ethan's, but more importantly they had heard the names of the children, because the names of children are the measure of any place. They walked the paths. They asked questions that weren't traps. They requested a copy of the curriculum and a cutting from a tree. They left with both and with stories about the time Ethan had thrown a charge into the mud and made it sizzle like breakfast. They left with a lullaby translated into their language that they promised to sing wrong until they learned to sing it right. River watched the visitors go and said, "We're famous." "We're useful," Ethan said. "That's better." "What's famous?" River asked. "Something that fades," Sarai said. "Usefulness sticks." River considered this and nodded and then ran off to be useful in a way that involved building a fort out of chairs. A year of good weather followed, which felt like a tender mercy, like a rain check on something you'd been denied. Fruit swelled. Children grew into awkwardness with the confidence that comes from having a village ready to laugh with them, not at them. Sarai painted the inside of the module a color that can only be described as the first morning after a long grief. Ethan built shelves and then filled them with objects that had no monetary value and all the other kinds. When the machines returned, they did not return to the settlement. They returned to the corridor beyond, a whisper of their old geometry scavenging what the war had left. The coalition sent ships. The ships were not enough. Someone had to hold a gate open or closed. Someone had to walk a map and decide where the safe passage would be. The someone turned out to be the string of settlements under Lena's jurisdiction, which meant Ethan and Sarai had to attend a council. They went. They sat at a table polished by elbows. They argued about routes and about distributing risk and about whether a town could be considered a wall if the town contained so many children that you felt like a monster asking it to hold. They decided yes with caveats. They drew lines that weren't lines, paths that wove like songs. They set watchers at hills. They rehearsed running without panic. They taught the littles a code: if 3 chimes, hide; if 1 long, home; if 2 short, dance. The last was a joke that became a ritual. The machines never made it that far. The coalition pushed them back in a battle that wasn't about winning so much as about telling the machines not here. The story reached Syllis as a lagging echo. The echo tasted like metal and relief. River asked, "Did we help?" Sarai ruffled his hair. "Yes," she said. "We taught our trees to make shade for people we haven't met yet. That is a weapon too." He nodded like a general. In the quiet that followed, A messenger from Earth arrived with a package wrapped in something like paper and something like memory. Ethan turned it over. It was from his old school, delivered by a chain of hands, each link a person who decided to carry weight not assigned to them. Inside were letters written by former students now scattered across worlds. They said things like, "You taught me how to hold panic in one hand and possibility in the other. And we built a library in a tent because you told us stories could survive any architecture. And when things were darkest, I remembered how you said the word tomorrow and I borrowed your mouth." He read them aloud and cried in a way that was not weakness. When he finished, Sarai kissed the top of his head the way you kiss a child who has done his chores and done them well. "Thank you," he said to the universe, and meant it. River took one of the letters and put it in his pocket. "For later," he said. "For when?" Sarai asked. "When I'm scared," he said. "I will borrow his mouth too." She hugged him so hard he squeaked. There were endings, as there must be. Some were large and flagged, some were small and quiet. A piece of the old station fell out of the sky one night and burned a streak across the atmosphere like a message from a friend who had died. Lena announced that she was retiring from being the person everyone blamed. She appointed 3 others to be blamed in relay, which was wisdom disguised as laziness. The hydrodome finally failed in a way that could not be patched. They built a new one and named it Sarai's house, even though she protested, until she saw the children proudly painting the sign and then only pretended to protest. There were beginnings, which is what endings are if you keep a certain posture. The orchard spread. The school dome got a second dome and then a third. The ditch became a canal and then a creek, and someone built a bridge and they danced on it, not because bridges are for dancing, but because you can dance on anything if you're careful and happy. One late evening, the traveler returned, older, a little thinner, carrying a device that projected holograms of the stories he'd collected. "I thought you might want to see the ones you missed," he said. He filled the dome with images. A woman on a salt world teaching her children to walk on stilts because the ground was poison. A man who built a kite big enough to carry a message across a canyon that had taken the only bridge. A boy who learned to repair a kind of engine everyone thought was mystical and turned out to be merely difficult. An alien choir singing to a machine until it forgot how to be cruel. Sarai and Ethan stood with the settlement and watched and wept and laughed and clapped and learned. The traveler pointed to one story and then to them. "You started a wave," he said. "You should know. People heard about your orchard, about your no, about your yes. About the night you threw a bomb into the mud and the way you taught kids to make stars from foot stomps. They started their own versions." Ethan felt embarrassment try to crawl up his neck, and he told it kindly to sit. "Good," he said. "That's how it should work." The traveler nodded. "I thought you might want to add an epilogue." Sarai smiled. "We're still writing ours," she said. On a day that smelled like apples and rain, River climbed a ladder to pick fruit and fell. It was a short fall. He twisted his ankle. He cried because pain demands it, and because he was 9 and 9 is an age that has not yet learned stoicism. Ethan scooped him up with a grunt and carried him to the clinic, performing the ritual of jokes that diminishes fear. Sarai walked beside, holding River's hand, whispering a litany that was half lullaby and half complaint to the universe delivered with love, which is the only way to complain that improves the complaint. The clinician taped the ankle and scolded the latter. River slept on Ethan's chest that night, drooling, declaring in his sleep that he could have flown if he'd had his pick. Ethan kissed his hair and felt something old and sharp and heavy move in his chest and then miraculously move out. He had carried grief for so long that his spine had adapted. He felt it lighten at last. He wondered if he would miss it the way you miss a tooth you worried with your tongue for years. He decided he would not. Sarai watched his face and knew. She put a hand on his cheek and some other old heaviness moved then, one he had not known he could set down. They lay there breathing the same air, not because they had to, but because it was another kind of feast. In the end, and there is always an end, though it is not a wall so much as a gate, they grew old in a way that felt like burning gently. Their hair changed to snow, their hands learned more names for ache. The orchard required them to ask for help in ways that embarrassed them for 10 seconds and then didn't. The children scattered like dandelion seeds and returned like seasons. Lynn sent messages from a water city she was building on a patient planet. Sierra sent a picture of a classroom with a river drawn on the floor. Jack sent a part from an engine with a note that said, "Listen," and when you put it to your ear, it hummed a note that was the pitch of home. Tomas wrote a book. Mira adopted 3 kids and then a 4th when the 4th looked at her like the world depended on it. River stayed and then left and then stayed and then left, because that is a healthy oscillation. Sarai and Ethan sat under a tree that had once been a stick and now wore the sky like a crown. They held hands. They watched clouds that looked like ships and ships that looked like clouds. They told the story again of the station with not water and the corridor with kneeling and the sentence that had changed the map. "Say it," Sarai whispered. "He did. You said you couldn't have children. I said good. I had enough for both." She laughed like a bell cracked and repaired. "You did," she said. "You do." He closed his eyes. He listened to the world thinking. It said, "You did good." It said, "Keep going." It said, "Don't let your last words be about endings." He opened his eyes. He squeezed her hand. They stood. Slowly, but they stood. There was bread to bake, and a class to teach, and a ditch to clear, and a celebration to plan for someone whose first tooth had just fallen out, and a meeting about wind turbines where he would pretend to understand and she would actually understand. There was the work of living, which is the best job because everyone is hired and you can't be fired unless you quit, and they had forgotten how. As dusk settled purple and soft, a traveler passing through slowed at the sight of the old couple under the tree and asked, "Is this the famous place? The one from the stories?" Sarai smiled. Ethan smiled. "We're just a settlement," he said. "We're just a family," she said. Same thing, they said together. The traveler asked for a lesson to carry. Ethan thought. Sarai thought. River, now nearly grown, shouted from the canal, "Tell them we endured." The traveler wrote this down. He took their picture without a camera using the old technique of memory. He walked on. The night came up soft. Somewhere, insects sang in grass that had learned their language from stones. Somewhere, a school dome held heat for a child who would wake at midnight and whisper to himself the names of constellations only he knew. Somewhere, a blue-skinned woman and a human man set bread on a table and called 7 names and then called one more, "Come eat." And that day, the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, thank you for listening. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.